She buried her baby on a Tuesday. By Friday, her body still hadn't gotten the news. The milk came anyway. Relentless, physical, cruel. A reminder that her body was still waiting for a child who would never cry again. Clara Whitmore had nothing left. No baby, no home, no place in the world that wanted her. And then, in the dark of her sister's kitchen, she heard a man's voice crack with desperation through the thin walls. A rancher whose newborn twins were starving because no woman in town would touch the scandal of helping him. If this story moves you, hit that like button right now, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and follow along because what happens next will stay with you long after it's over. The ground was still frozen when they buried Eliza. That was what Clara had named her, Eliza Ann Whitmore, in the 3 hours between the birth and the silence. 3 hours was long enough to count her fingers, to feel the weak pull of her mouth, to believe stupidly and completely that the worst was already over. The labor had been brutal, the kind that left a woman not knowing which direction was up, and when the midwife finally placed the baby on Clara's chest, she'd thought, "We made it." She had actually thought that. She was 26 years old and had never been more wrong about anything. By morning, Eliza was gone. The midwife said it was the heart. Something had been wrong with it from the very beginning, something no one could have seen or stopped or fixed. Clara didn't remember much of what came after. She remembered the cold. She remembered someone trying to take Eliza from her arms and her refusing. She remembered her sister Dorothy's face in the doorway, not quite able to come all the way into the room. That was November. By December, Clara had moved out of the small boarding room she'd been renting. She couldn't afford it anymore. Not without the wages she'd stopped earning when she spent the final weeks of her pregnancy too large and too exhausted to work the laundry, and she had no choice but to accept Dorothy's grudging offer of the spare room in the house Dorothy shared with her husband, Roy Pitcher. Roy Pitcher was the kind of man who made every kindness feel like a debt. He didn't say anything outright, not at first. He just looked at Clara across the dinner table with that particular expression, the one that said, "You are a problem I am tolerating," and made small comments that weren't quite complaints, but were never quite not complaints either. "We're running low on flour, Dorothy. That's odd." Or, "The fire burns through wood faster with more bodies in the house." Clara understood the language. She'd been raised around men like Roy. She did her best to make herself invisible, to eat less, to stay in her room, to help with the washing and the cooking without being asked, without being seen. It didn't help. Because the thing Clara couldn't control, the thing that humiliated her every morning and made Roy look at her like she was something unclean, was the milk. Her body didn't know. That was the brutal, simple fact of it. Her body had spent 9 months preparing, building, getting ready to feed a child, and when that child was gone, her body simply didn't understand the instruction to stop. The milk came in anyway, heavy and insistent, soaking through her blouses if she wasn't careful. Aching if too much time passed between the times she relieved the pressure in private, alone in her room with a cloth and a wash basin, and the specific humiliation of a body betraying her in the most intimate way possible. Dorothy knew. Dorothy had whispered gently that it would stop eventually. A few weeks, maybe 6, maybe 8. But Dorothy said it in the hallway and then went back to the kitchen, and Roy must have known too because he started looking at Clara differently after that, with something that wasn't pity and wasn't disgust but was some uncomfortable combination of both. She heard him say it to Dorothy one night in late December, his voice low but not low enough, carrying through the wall between their bedroom and the hallway where Clara had stopped walking. "She can't stay here indefinitely. People are talking. A widow who lost her baby and still has... It isn't decent. It makes us look like we're running a charity house." Dorothy's response was too quiet to make out. "I don't care how long she needs," Roy said. "She can't stay here through winter. She needs to find work. Or find another situation. It's not what we agreed to." Clara stood in the hallway for a moment, very still, and then she walked carefully back to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and did not cry. She'd already cried everything she had. What was left was something colder than crying. A practical, clear-eyed understanding that she needed to leave, and soon, and that she had approximately nothing to do it with. She was thinking about that, running the numbers in her head, trying to figure out whether Mrs. Hollis at the laundry would take her back before her body had finished settling, whether she could rent a room at the boarding house again if she worked extra hours. When she heard the men at the front door. Dusk. She wasn't supposed to be listening. She was in the hallway getting a glass of water from the kitchen, and Roy had answered the door and she could hear the voices from the entry. Roy's and then another man's, lower and rougher, carrying the flattened exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept in days. "Just asking if you've heard of anyone," the man was saying. "I'm not asking for charity. I'll pay. I'll pay whatever's fair. I just need... My boys are... There's two of them, and they won't stop crying, and I don't know what else to do." Roy's voice, brisk and uncomfortable. "That's a hard situation, Hale. A hard situation. But I don't know what you expect me to do about it. I'm going to every house in town. I've already been to 6. I just need a woman who's nursing, or who recently..." "There's no one here who fits that description," Roy said. Fast, final, a pause. "Right," the man said. "All right. I'm sorry to bother you." The door closed. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway with her empty glass and did not move. 2 of them. He'd said 2. Twins, maybe. And their mother... If he was looking for a nursing woman, that meant their mother was gone. And he'd been to 6 houses already, in the cold, at night, and no one had said yes. She thought about that while she filled her glass. She thought about it while she drank the water slowly. She thought about it while she walked back to her room and sat down on the edge of the bed again, and she was still thinking about it an hour later when the house went quiet and the lamp in the hallway burned down. Hale. Roy had called him Hale. She knew that name vaguely, the way you knew names in a town this size. Not personally, just by reputation, by overhearing. Gideon Hale. He had a ranch about 3 miles out, east of town. His wife had died. Clara had heard that too, sometime in the past weeks, though she hadn't paid close attention because she was deep in her own grief and other people's tragedies had felt very far away at the time. His wife had died and left him with newborn twins, and he was going door to door in the dark, asking for help, and no one was saying yes. Clara lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling. She knew why no one was saying yes. It wasn't complicated. A woman who went to care for a widowed man's babies, who lived in his house, who... The town would decide what it meant before she got there. It didn't matter what the actual arrangement was. It never mattered what the actual arrangement was. The story would be written the moment she walked through his door, and it would not be a kind story. And everyone would believe it because believing the unkind version of a woman's choices cost them nothing. She knew all of that. She lay there knowing it for a long time. Then she thought about the sound of his voice through the door. They won't stop crying. And she thought about Eliza, and she thought about the milk that was going to come in again in a few hours, whether she liked it or not. This body, with its stubborn, purposeless abundance. And she thought about Roy Pitcher saying she can't stay here indefinitely, and Dorothy not disagreeing, and she thought, what exactly am I protecting? She sat up. She put on her coat. So, it was cold the way only a prairie night in December can be cold. The kind of cold that gets inside your bones and reminds you that the frontier doesn't care about your problems. There were no street lamps past the edge of town, so Clara walked by moonlight, which was bright enough that she could see the road, and she just followed it east, 3 miles. Alone, carrying nothing but a small cloth bag with a change of blouse and her good wool shawl. She didn't let herself think too hard about what she was doing. Thinking too hard had kept her in that room for weeks. And thinking too hard had a way of convincing you that reasonable caution was the same thing as wisdom. And right now, she didn't have the luxury of wisdom. She just had the road and the cold and the sound of a man saying they won't stop crying and a body that ached like it was trying to tell her something. The Hill Ranch came into view around a bend, a main house, a barn slightly to the left, a fence line she could see against the white of the frost on the ground. There was a light on in the house. More than one. It was past midnight, and every lamp in the place was burning, and as Clara came closer she could hear, faintly at first, and then with complete clarity, crying. 2 of them, overlapping, trading off so that whenever one paused, the other filled the gap. A ragged, exhausted, desperate sound that she felt in her chest before she heard it with her ears. She stopped at the fence gate and just stood there for a moment with her hand on the cold metal latch, and it was a very strange feeling to be standing outside a house in the dark, a stranger, listening to 2 babies cry. She opened the gate, she knocked on the door. There was a long pause, long enough that she wondered if he'd heard it over the crying, and then footsteps. And the door opened, and the man standing in it looked like someone who had been through a battle and lost. He was tall, dark-haired, probably mid-30s, with a face that might have been ordinary if it hadn't been pulled tight with exhaustion and something past exhaustion, something that looked like the specific desperation of a person who has run out of options. He was holding both babies, one in each arm, both screaming, and he was doing that unconscious swaying thing that people do when they've been walking a baby for hours and their body just keeps going. He looked at her. She looked at him. The babies kept crying. "I heard you at the door earlier," Clara said. "At my brother-in-law's house. Roy Pitcher." His face shifted, not with recognition, but with confusion. My name is Clara Whitmore. I lost my baby 2 months ago." She said it straight out, no softening, because there was no way to soften it that didn't make it worse. "My milk is still coming in. I can help." He just stared at her. "I know it's the middle of the night," Clara said. I know how this looks. But you went to 6 houses and no one said yes, and those babies have been crying for—" She paused. "How long have they been crying?" "Since noon," he said. His voice was flat with exhaustion. "Yesterday." She did the math. More than 12 hours. "Can I come in?" He stepped back without saying anything, which she took as a yes. The inside of the house was warm, at least. He'd kept the fire going, which meant he had enough presence of mind for that even in the middle of this. But it was in the specific chaos of a place where a man who doesn't know anything about babies has been trying to take care of 2 of them alone. There were cloths everywhere, a pot that had been used to warm something and not cleaned, a rocking chair pulled right up to the fire, 2 small cradles pushed together in the corner of the main room. Though neither baby was in them because he'd apparently given up on that, Clara set her bag down and held out her hands. He hesitated for just a second, and she understood that, the strangeness of handing your children to someone you'd met 40 seconds ago at midnight. But then he transferred one of the babies to her arms with the careful precision of a man terrified of doing it wrong. It was a girl, small, impossibly light, red-faced from crying, with dark eyes squinting open between sobs. Clara settled her against her chest, and the baby's crying didn't stop. Not yet, but it changed slightly, shifted down a register, as if something in the contact itself was registering. Different hands. Pay attention. "She's Ruby," the man said. "The boy is Noah." A pause. "I'm Gideon." "I know," Clara said. "I've heard your name." She sat down in the rocking chair and didn't ask permission, because there wasn't time for permission, and she opened her blouse and put Ruby to her breast, and the baby latched with a ferocity that made Clara's eyes sting. Not from pain exactly, or not only from pain, but from something that was too many things at once to name clearly. The silence, when it came, was sudden. Ruby went from screaming to eating in the space of 3 seconds, and the contrast was so absolute that Gideon Hale actually took a visible step back, like a man who'd been leaning into a strong wind that had abruptly stopped. Noah was still crying in his arms, a smaller, thinner sound now, confused by the quiet. "Sit down," Clara said, without looking up from Ruby. "Bring him here. She'll only need a few minutes, and then you can switch." He sat, not gracefully, more like his knees gave out, in the chair across from her, still holding Noah, and he did the rocking sway automatically while he watched her with an expression she couldn't quite read. It wasn't what she'd been bracing for. It wasn't the leering she'd half expected from a man in this situation, alone at night with a strange woman in his house. It was something quieter and more complicated. It looked, if she was honest, like relief so profound it had broken something open behind his eyes. "When did you last sleep?" Clara asked. "I don't know," Gideon said. "What day is it?" She almost smiled. "Thursday. Then Tuesday? Wednesday? I slept a little on— I don't know." He shook his head. "My wife's sister came for the first week after. She came and she helped, and then she had to go back. She has children of her own. And after that, it was just— I didn't know. I thought I could figure it out. I tried everything. The store had some kind of— The man at the store said there was a mixture they used. It's not the same," Clara said. Not unkindly. "No," Gideon said. "No, clearly it's not." Ruby had slowed her frantic eating and was settling into a steadier rhythm, and Clara looked down at her, at this small dark-haired girl she'd never seen before tonight, and felt something she didn't have a name for move through her like water settling after a disturbance. Not joy exactly, not grief exactly. Something in between the two that was its own thing, taking up exactly the space that had been empty for 2 months. "I'm going to need you to understand something," Clara said. She kept her voice even. "I don't know what you've heard about me. My situation, what happened." "I haven't heard anything," Gideon said. "I've been a little occupied." "Fair enough." She glanced up. "But the town is going to have opinions about this, about me being here. I want to be straightforward with you about that from the beginning." Gideon looked at her steadily. He had brown eyes, she noticed. Not remarkable on their own, but they had a directness to them that she found easier to look at than she'd expected. "I knocked on 6 doors tonight," he said. 6. Men I've known for years, women I've known for years, and not a single one of them opened the door wide enough to actually look at my children. They looked at me. A pause. "The town's opinions aren't high on my list of concerns right now." Clara nodded. "All right." She switched Ruby to the other side, which took a moment of adjustment that Ruby protested briefly before settling back in. Noah's crying had decreased to a low, intermittent complaint, the sound of a baby who could sense that something was changing even if he didn't know what yet. "Can I—" Gideon started. "Yes," Clara said. "Bring him here when she's done. Another few minutes." He nodded and went back to the swaying, and they sat there in the firelit room while the wind moved outside and Ruby ate with the concentrated devotion of a creature with very simple and very urgent priorities. "Her name was Margaret," Gideon said after a while, not looking at anything in particular. "My wife. It was fast. The birth started fine, and then it wasn't, and they couldn't. The doctor said sometimes there's nothing to be done. He said that a lot. I don't know if he was right or just saying something." Clara didn't say anything. "She wanted to name the girl Ruby," he continued. "She'd picked it out before, said it sounded like something that would last. I don't know why she thought that." He paused. "I named the boy. Noah was her grandfather's name. She'd mentioned it once, a long time ago, that she liked it." Clara looked up from Ruby's face. "They're beautiful," she said, and meant it, despite everything. Despite the red and the squalling and the weeks of starvation that had left them both thinner than they should have been. There was something stubborn and alive in both of them that she could see even now, even this exhausted. "Are they going to be all right?" Gideon asked. And the way he asked it, trying and failing to sound like he was asking a practical question, told her everything about the past 3 weeks of his life. "Yes," Clara said. She said it firmly, because firmness was what was needed, even though she couldn't be certain, even though she knew as well as anyone that certainty wasn't something you could guarantee. "They're hungry, that's all this is. They're very hungry, and they'll eat, and then they'll sleep, and in the morning we'll figure out the rest." He let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. She switched Noah in for Ruby protesting the interruption before succumbing to satisfied sleep against Gideon's shoulder, and Noah latched just as desperately as his sister had, with the same ferocious intent, and Clara sat in the rocking chair in the middle of the night in a stranger's house feeding a baby that wasn't hers. And the feeling she had was not happiness exactly, and not peace exactly, but something that was closer to purpose than anything she'd felt in 2 months. After Noah finished and went boneless with sleep, she put both babies down in the cradle together. They calmed the moment they were touching, sides pressed together, the contact doing something for them that the separate cradles clearly hadn't. And she pulled her blouse closed and stood up and turned around to find Gideon Hale asleep in the chair across the fire, with his mouth slightly open and his arms still curved in the shape of holding a baby. She stood there looking at him for a moment. Then she found a blanket on the back of the other chair and put it over him without waking him. And she sat back down in the rocking chair and watched the fire and the sleeping babies and listened to the wind outside and thought about absolutely nothing. Outside, the cold continued. Inside, for the first time in a long time, everything was quiet. By morning, the complications had already started. Clara was up before Gideon, feeding Noah when he woke at first light while Ruby slept on in the cradle, and she had water heating and was trying to figure out where things were in the kitchen, a process complicated by the fact that a man who has been alone with 2 newborns for a week doesn't do a lot of organized kitchen management. when Gideon came awake in the chair with a start and a sharp look around the room that settled the moment he saw her. "You stayed," he said. "The babies needed another feeding around 4, Clara said. "I didn't want to wake you." He was quiet for a moment, working through something. Then, "I need to ask you something directly." "All right, what is it you're looking for here?" He said it without accusation, just as a question. "I need to understand, because I can't. I'm not in a position to take advantage of someone who's in a bad situation of their own. And I won't pretend I don't know that you coming here in the middle of the night means something was pushing you." She'd been expecting him to ask something like this, and she'd thought about the answer during the night. "I need work," she said, "and a place to stay. Not because of... I'm not looking for anything beyond what's practical. I can care for the babies. I can help with the house. I'll find other work as soon as I'm able, when my body has had time to settle properly. But right now," she paused, "right now I have something to offer, and so do you, and I think that's probably enough of a reason." Gideon nodded slowly. He looked at Noah in her arms, and something crossed his face. Gratitude, or the complicated feeling that sits underneath gratitude and is harder to name. "I can pay you." "I know you said that last night. I mean it. I don't want you to think this is charity on your part. I'll pay you a wage." "We can talk about what's fair," Clara said, "after breakfast." She didn't tell him what Roy had said through the wall. She didn't explain that she had nowhere else to go, or that the milk was part of what had been destroying her. That carrying this abundance with no child to give it to had been a specific and terrible cruelty she'd been living with for 2 months. Those were her reasons, and they were true, but they were also hers, and she wasn't ready to hand them to a stranger yet. What she said instead was, "Put the coffee on. You look like you need it more than I do." He laughed, short, rough, surprised out of him, and it was the first real human sound she'd heard in this house, and she filed it away somewhere without quite meaning to. They had breakfast. It wasn't much. He didn't have a lot in the house, and what he had wasn't organized. But the coffee was strong, and they sat across the table from each other while the babies slept and talked about practical things, schedules, what the twins seemed to need, where the supplies were that he'd stockpiled but hadn't been able to make use of. Outside, the town was waking up. And somewhere in town, someone had already seen Clara Whitmore walk out in the middle of the night with her bag, and was already, with great enthusiasm, drawing their own conclusions. Clara knew this. She knew it the way you know a storm is coming, not because you can see it yet, but because the air has that particular quality. She drank her coffee and listened to Noah make small sounds in his sleep, and thought about what Roy Pitcher was going to say when he found out where she'd gone, and thought about what Dorothy would say, and thought about the 6 houses Gideon had knocked on the night before, and the 6 doors that had stayed mostly closed. She had made her decision in the middle of the night, and the daylight hadn't changed it. 2 babies were sleeping quietly for the first time in days. That was enough to start with. The first week was survival, plain and simple. Clara didn't think about the future during that week. Didn't think about what people were saying in town, or what Roy Pitcher's face must have looked like when he found her room empty and her bag gone. She thought about feeding schedules and whether Ruby was latching correctly on the left side. She wasn't, not quite. There was a shallow angle that would become painful if Clara didn't correct it. And she thought about the fact that Noah ran warmer than his sister and needed 1 fewer blanket. And she thought about how to tell Gideon, tactfully, that the corn mixture the store had sold him as a substitute was the reason both babies had been screaming for days before she arrived. She didn't tell him tactfully. She told him directly, because she'd decided in those first few hours that directness was going to be the only thing that worked between 2 people who were strangers doing something this unusual, and tact had a way of leaving room for misunderstanding. "Throw it out," she said on the second morning, holding up the tin from the store shelf. Gideon looked at it. The man at the store said, "The man at the store has never fed a newborn in his life. Throw it out." He threw it out. That was the shape of the first week. Clara did what needed doing, and Gideon did what she told him, and neither of them talked much beyond the practical, which suited them both. He was still running on fractured sleep and grief and the specific bewilderment of a man who'd built his entire life around physical competence. He could fix a fence line in the dark, could read weather in the color of clouds, could manage cattle through a hard winter, and had discovered that none of that competence transferred to the care of 2 infants. He was not bad at it, exactly. He was just lost in a way he didn't know how to navigate, and Clara's presence meant he could be lost less catastrophically. She slept in the small room off the kitchen, a room that had clearly been used for storage, still half full of boxes and a broken chair she pushed into the corner. And she woke for the night feedings and let Gideon sleep through, or tried to. He kept waking anyway, kept appearing in the doorway with his hair disordered and his eyes not quite focused, asking if she needed anything. "I need you to sleep," she told him on the third night. "I can't," he said. I keep waking up thinking they've stopped breathing." She understood that fear. She didn't say so. "Go back to bed. If something's wrong, I'll get you." "You're sure?" "Gideon." She said his name for the first time with that particular firmness, and he looked at her, really looked at her, and then he went back to bed. By the 5th day, Noah had stopped losing weight. By the 7th, Ruby was gaining. Clara weighed them the only way she had available, which was holding them against her chest and then hefting a sack of flour she'd weighed on the kitchen scale, comparing the heft of things with the imprecision that the situation required. It wasn't scientific, but she'd helped enough women in the last few years, friends, neighbors, women at the laundry who'd had babies and had questions, that she trusted her sense of things, and her sense was that both babies were turning a corner. She told Gideon on a Thursday evening when he came in from the barn with cold still on his coat. "They're getting stronger," she said. He stopped in the doorway. He had a look she'd started to recognize. The look of a man who'd been bracing himself so long he'd forgotten what it felt like not to. "You're sure?" "Pretty sure." "Noah, definitely. Ruby's slower, but she's eating longer at each feeding. Give it another week." He nodded. He took off his coat and hung it on the hook and stood there for a moment with his back to her, and she had the impression he was collecting himself. When he turned around, his expression was something she couldn't quite read. "Clara," he said, "I don't know how to say this right." "Then say it wrong," she said. "I won't hold it against you." He almost smiled. "Thank you. I know I said that already. I know I said it the first morning, and it wasn't enough then either, but I don't have better words. You walked 3 miles in the dark to a stranger's house, and you—" He stopped, started again. "My children are alive because of what you decided to do. I want you to know I understand that." Clara looked down at Ruby, who was asleep in her arms with the loose bonelessness of a well-fed baby. "Don't make it more than it was," she said. "I needed something to do, and you needed help. That's an arrangement. It doesn't need to be a debt. I'm not saying it's a debt. I'm saying I'm grateful." "All right," she said. "You're welcome." She meant it to close the subject, and mostly it did. But that night, after the babies were settled and she was in her storage room listening to the wind work at the roof, she thought about what he'd said. "My children are alive." And she thought about Eliza, and the grief came back in its usual form, which was not dramatic but just present, like a stone she carried in her chest that she sometimes forgot about and then remembered. She lay in the dark and breathed through it, and in the morning she got up and fed Noah and Ruby and made coffee, and that was the choice she kept making, every day, until it started to feel like something other than just choosing not to stop. The talk in town started sooner than she'd expected, which was saying something because she'd expected it to start immediately. She didn't hear it directly at first. She heard it the way you hear weather, through other things. When she walked to the mercantile at the end of the second week to buy supplies, the first time she'd gone to town since arriving at the ranch, she noticed how Mrs. Callan at the dry goods counter straightened her back in a particular way when Clara walked in, how the 2 women by the fabric bolts went quiet and then resumed their conversation in a lower register, how Mr. Callan's greeting was technically polite and actually chilly in a way that had a specific quality to it. Clara bought what she needed and didn't look at anyone too long, and walked back to the ranch with a sack of supplies and a clear understanding that the conversation had already happened without her. She told Gideon that night. "I know," he said. He was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee he hadn't been drinking. "Ed Garrity said something to me yesterday when I was getting feed." "What did he say?" Gideon looked at the coffee. "He said he understood I was in a difficult position, and he hoped I was being careful about appearances." A pause. "I told him my children were no longer starving, which seemed more important than appearances." "How did he take that?" "Not well." He looked up. "Clara, I want to be straight with you. I know what they're saying. I know what they think this is, And I want to know. Does it bother you? Because if it does, I need to know that. I can't ask you to. It bothers me, Clara said simply, but it was going to bother me whether I came here or not. Roy Pitcher was already making sure of that. She picked up a cloth and folded it, a habit, something to do with her hands. The difference is here it bothers me for something that matters. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Your brother-in-law. You said his name the first night. He's the one who... He told you no when you knocked on his door, Clara said, and then he went and talked about me to anyone who'd listen. He's been doing that since November. She kept her voice flat, matter-of-fact. He thinks I'm an embarrassment to Dorothy. He's probably right, but he's also the one making sure everyone knows it, so... What does Dorothy say? That was harder to answer. Clara thought about her sister. Dorothy, with her careful way of looking at walls when she didn't want to say something. Dorothy, who had been gentle to Clara in small moments when Roy wasn't watching, and then had seemed to forget it when he was. Dorothy does what Roy tells her to do, she said finally. That's its own kind of situation. Gideon didn't push it. He drank his coffee. I'm not going anywhere, Clara said, if that's what you're circling around asking. I wasn't sure you'd want to stay, given the babies still need me, she said, and I have nowhere better to be. She said the second part flatly, without self-pity, as a simple statement of fact. So I'm staying. He nodded. She could tell there was more he wanted to say, and she could tell he'd decided not to say it yet, and she respected that he understood where the edges were. The week settled into something that had the texture, if not the emotional content, of a household. Clara took the mornings with the babies. Gideon managed the ranch, the cattle, the barn, the fences that needed attention after weeks of neglect while he'd been consumed with the twins, and came back for meals and the evenings. They developed a language of small negotiations that wasn't quite comfortable and wasn't quite tense, but occupied some middle territory that Clara found she didn't mind. He was a different man rested than he'd been exhausted. That was the first thing she noticed as the weeks went on. The man she'd met on that first night, drawn tight, stripped down to nothing but desperation, gave way gradually to someone more specific, more complicated. He was not easy to talk to exactly. He had a habit of going quiet in the middle of conversations, not rudely, but just leaving, briefly, going somewhere internal before coming back. He was particular about certain things, his tools and the way things in the barn were organized, and flexible about others, including most of what happened inside the house, where he seemed genuinely to have no strong opinions and left Clara entirely in charge. He was also, she discovered, funnier than she'd expected. Not in a performing way. He didn't tell jokes or work for laughs, but he had a dry observation about things that sometimes caught her off guard. And the first time he made her laugh, a real laugh, not a polite one, they both seemed slightly surprised by it. It was over a chicken. He'd bought a laying hen from a neighbor in a transaction he described as theoretically simple, which had resulted in the hen living in the barn for 3 days because she refused to go into the coop, 3 days of complex negotiations that he relayed at dinner with such precise, baffled detail that Clara had started laughing before she quite knew she was doing it. She's smarter than the coop, he said. I can't explain it otherwise. She has a plan. The chicken has a plan. The chicken has a plan, he confirmed very seriously. I'm choosing to respect it. She laughed again, and this time he smiled. Not widely, just that particular slight shift at the corner of his mouth. And they ate dinner and talked about nothing important for a while. And afterward, Clara sat with the babies and felt something she'd nearly forgotten she was capable of, which was simply that she was not unhappy. She didn't examine it too closely. She'd learned that closely examining things that might be fragile had a way of breaking them. Roy Pitcher showed up at the ranch on a Tuesday in the 3rd week. Clara saw him coming from the kitchen window, and she thought, here it is. She'd been waiting for this specific thing without knowing quite what form it would take, and she stood at the window for a moment watching Roy ride up the road before she went to the front door and opened it before he knocked. Roy looked at her. His expression was the one she knew, the combining of disapproval and something almost satisfied, as if he'd been right about her all along, and this confirmed it. Clara, he said. Roy, she said, Gideon's in the south field. You'll have to talk to me. That was not what he wanted to do. She could see it. But she held the door and he came in because he was the kind of man who always came in when a door was opened, regardless of whether the welcome was real. He stood in the middle of the main room and looked around with the specific assessment of a man calculating things, and Clara sat down and picked up Noah and held him on her knee, partly because it was nearly time for a feeding, and partly because having the baby in her arms made the situation less abstract. "Dorothy is worried about you," Roy said. "Dorothy can come herself if she's worried," Clara said. His jaw tightened. "You know why she can't. You know what this looks like." "I know what it looks like to you," Clara said. "I know what you've told people it looks like." A short silence. "I've only told the truth," Roy said. "You've told your version of things, which you're entitled to," Clara said. "So is everyone else, apparently." She adjusted Noah on her knee. He was making the pre-hungry sounds, the small, escalating complaints that preceded actual crying. "What is it you actually want, Roy? Because I don't think Dorothy sent you. I think you came on your own." Something moved across his face. "I want you to come home." "That house was never my home." "You know what I mean. I want you out of this." He gestured vaguely, sweepingly at the room, at her, at the baby in her arms. "Situation." "Why?" "Because you're making the family look—" "Your family," Clara said. "I'm not your family. I'm Dorothy's sister, and Dorothy has not told me to leave. And you don't have the right to tell me to leave a house you don't own." She said it without heat. "I'm here because 2 babies needed someone to care for them, and because I'm being paid a fair wage to do that work. There is nothing happening here that requires your concern." Roy stared at her for a moment with the baffled fury of a man who'd prepared for a different conversation. He'd expected tears, maybe. Shame. Something he could move. "People are talking about you," he said. "People have been talking about me since November," Clara said. "That's not new information." Noah started crying in earnest then, and Clara opened her blouse without ceremony simply because the baby needed to eat, and Roy Pitcher was going to have to deal with that, and the expression on his face was so profoundly uncomfortable that she might have found it funny in different circumstances. He left. She listened to his horse on the road and watched Noah eat and thought, that's not the end of it. She knew Roy well enough to know that. He'd left because she hadn't given him anything to grab hold of, but he would find another approach, some other angle, because men like Roy did not give up when they'd decided something needed to happen. They just found a different door. She was right about that. She just didn't know how much damage he'd do in the meantime. The gossip hardened over the next 2 weeks. That was the only word for it. Hardened, became something with structure to it, with a consistent shape when people repeated it. Clara heard different versions of it through different sources. From the minister's wife who came to the ranch on some stated errand of Christian charity and left loaded with information she would distribute carefully. From a young woman named Annie Greer who brought eggs and seemed genuinely friendly and then mentioned awkwardly that her mother had asked her to find out if Clara was truly living in the house. And from Gideon himself, who came home one afternoon in the 4th week with a set jaw and told her that the men at the feed store had made a comment he hadn't responded to, but had also not been able to stop thinking about. "What did they say?" Clara asked. He told her. It was coarse. She'd expected coarse, the version that imagined a different kind of arrangement than the one that actually existed. But hearing it said out loud, in Gideon's flat, careful voice, made it more solid in a way that she hadn't been quite prepared for. She was quiet for a moment. "They said something similar to me at the mercantile," she said. "Not out loud, but the way Mrs. Callan talks to me has changed." Gideon set down what he'd been holding, a piece of harness he'd been mending, and looked at her directly. "I can say something. To the men, to whoever needs to hear it said. Saying something will make it more interesting to them, not less," Clara said. "The best thing is to ignore it." "The best thing," Gideon said, and there was an edge to his voice she hadn't heard before, "would be for people to mind their own business. The best thing would be for 6 doors not to have been closed in my face when my children were dying." He stopped. "Let the edge settle. I know what you're saying. I know you're right. I just—" He picked the harness back up. "I don't like it." "I know," Clara said. "Neither do I." They ate dinner in a silence that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't angry either. The silence of 2 people who were frustrated by the same thing and had run out of words for it. Okay. What Clara hadn't anticipated, what surprised her, in the way that good things surprised her because she'd stopped expecting them, was how quickly she began to love the twins. She'd known she would care for them. She'd known the milk was part of what had brought her, and the guilt of that, the sense that she'd come partly for her own reasons and dressed them up as generosity, had sat with her in the early days. But loving them was different from caring for them. Loving them happened against her will, the way breathing happened. Not as a decision, but as a physical fact she noticed one morning when Ruby, now 6 weeks old and filling out into something less newborn and more genuinely infant, grabbed Clara's finger in her sleep and held it with that fierce, mindless grip that babies have, and Clara looked down at that small fist around her finger and thought, oh no, it was a disaster, in the way that love is always a disaster. It complicated everything. Because this was not her children. They were Margaret Hale's children, and they were Gideon's children, and Clara was the woman being paid to care for them. And she had no claim on them, and never would, and the town was already talking, and she had made a careful, practical arrangement that was going to become very impractical if she was not careful. She was not careful. That was the problem. She had never been good at being careful in the ways that mattered. She started staying up in the evenings after the babies were down, sitting in the main room by the fire while Gideon worked or read. At first there was a reason, mending or going over what supplies were needed. And then there wasn't really a reason, and she sat there anyway because the alternative was the storage room and the quiet. Gideon didn't say anything about it. He started leaving a lamp on her side of the room without making a thing of it. They talked, not always about important things, sometimes about nothing, the chicken and her continued strategic refusal to use the coop correctly, the weather patterns Gideon knew how to read in the cloud formations at dusk, the book Clara had found on the shelf and asked about, sometimes about harder things, Cass, his wife, and Clara's daughter, and the specific way that grief doesn't follow a schedule no matter how much you want it to. Those conversations happened in short pieces, never all at once, because neither of them could handle them all at once. One night in the 5th week, Gideon looked up from what he was reading and said, out of nowhere, "Do you miss having someone?" Clara looked up. "What?" "A partner, someone." He said it carefully, watching her face. I'm asking because I realized I miss it. Not Margaret specifically, or not only Margaret. I miss there being someone in the house, someone to talk to." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I miss it. I didn't know if that was—" He stopped. "If that was an appropriate thing to say." "It's an honest thing to say," Clara said. "Honest is usually more useful." He nodded, looked back at his book, and didn't say anything else. And Clara sat across the fire from him and thought about how dangerous this particular kind of comfort could become. And then thought about how she was already past the point where thinking about it made much difference. Outside, the nights were getting slightly less cold. Spring was coming, the way spring always came on the frontier. Not gently, not as a gift, but in grudging increments, 1 degree at a time, as if the land needed to be convinced. Inside the ranch, something else was coming too, slower and less obvious, building in the way that things build when two people spend enough time in the same space and stop pretending they don't notice each other. Clara was aware of it. She suspected Gideon was too. Neither of them said anything, because the situation was complicated enough without adding that, and because some things you don't say until you can't not say them. Roy Pitcher, meanwhile, had found his different door. Clara didn't know that yet. She was sitting by the fire with a sleeping baby on her shoulder, and the quiet settling around her like something she might deserve. And she did not know what was already moving toward her from the direction of town, wearing the shape of a town council meeting and a wealthy widow named Evelyn Ashcroft. She didn't know yet. So for one more night, she sat in the warm room with Gideon reading across the fire and the twins asleep in their cradle, and she let herself have it. Just the moment, just the ordinary, unremarkable piece of it, without asking how long it would last. Roy Pitcher had always understood that the most effective way to move people was not force but arrangement. You didn't push people toward what you wanted. You arranged things so that they moved there themselves, believing the direction was their own idea. He'd spent 3 weeks after Clara left arranging things. He started with Reverend Moss, who was not a bad man but was a man who believed deeply in the social order and who could be counted on to see a threat to that order in almost any situation involving a woman living outside conventional expectations. Roy didn't tell Reverend Moss what to think. He just had a a concerned brotherly conversation as one family man to another, about how worried he was about his sister-in-law's situation, how he feared she was being taken advantage of, how he hoped the community would find some way to help restore some propriety to the Hale household before things progressed further. Reverend Moss found his own conclusions. They aligned, more or less exactly, with the ones Roy had quietly arranged. From Reverend Moss it went to the deacons, and from the deacons to their wives, and from their wives through the particular velocity that information achieves when it is dressed up as concern and passed woman to woman across back fences and dry goods counters. By the time it reached the town council, 5 men who met in the back room of the hardware store on the second Tuesday of every month to discuss civic matters, it had the shape and weight of a genuine community problem requiring a solution. The solution came in the form of Evelyn Ashcroft. Clara heard about the meeting secondhand from Annie Greer, who came out to the ranch on a Thursday with eggs she hadn't actually needed to deliver, and a guilty look that told Clara this was not entirely a social call. "I thought you should know," Annie said, standing at the kitchen door with her basket. "Before they come out here, I thought it wasn't right that nobody warned you." "Come in," Claire said. Annie came in and put the eggs on the table and stood with her hands clasped together in the way of someone who has decided to do a brave thing and is still not sure they're brave enough. She was 22, the daughter of a farmer on the north end of town, with a round, honest face that showed everything she was thinking, whether she wanted it to or not. Clara had liked her from the beginning, liked the way she hadn't pretended the gossip wasn't happening, but also hadn't been cruel about it. "They met on Tuesday," Annie said. "The council. My father's not on it, but he heard from Mr. Webb, who is." She took a breath. "They're saying that Hale's household needs to be put in order. That's how Mr. Webb put it. Put in order, and they've got a plan." "What plan?" Clara said. Not a question exactly. More like bracing. "Mrs. Ashcroft," Annie said. "Evelyn Ashcroft. You know who she is?" Clara knew the name the way she knew most names in the county. By reputation, by adjacency. Evelyn Ashcroft was the widow of Franklin Ashcroft, who'd owned the largest parcel of farmland west of town before he died 2 years ago and left everything to his wife. She was wealthy by local standards, respectable by any standard, and Clara had seen her once at the Mercantile, a tall, handsome woman in her 40s with the particular carriage of someone who had never needed to apologize for taking up space. "What about her?" Clara said. "They want her to come here, to the ranch." Annie said it carefully, watching Clara's face. "To take over the care of the babies. They think, Mr. Webb said they think she's a more appropriate person to be in this household. They think if she comes here, and if things progress, if Gideon were to perhaps consider—" Annie stopped, unable to quite finish the sentence. Clara finished it for her. "If Gideon were to marry her, you mean?" Annie looked at the table. "They think it would solve the problem. The family would be restored properly, respectable. And then I could go back where I came from," Clara said. The silence that followed had weight in it. Annie looked miserable. "I'm sorry, Clara. I know it isn't fair. I know what you've done here, what those babies would be without you, and it isn't right." "When are they coming?" Clara asked. "Saturday." Today was Thursday. Clara nodded. She picked up one of the eggs from Annie's basket and turned it over in her hand, not looking at it, just having something to hold. "Does Gideon know?" "I don't know. Mr. Webb was going to write to him. Whether the letter came yet—" Annie shook her head. After Annie left, Clara sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Noah and Ruby were asleep in the other room. They napped in the early afternoon now with the reliability of clockwork, which was one of the small miracles she'd stopped noticing because she'd gotten used to it. She could hear the barn sounds from outside, the cattle shifting, the particular creaking of the structure that she'd come to understand as its version of quiet. She sat and thought with the careful, unhurried attention of someone taking honest stock of a situation. She had known something like this was coming. She had known it in the way that you know a wound is going to scar before it finishes healing, not because you want it to, but because you understand how things work. The town had been building towards something for 6 weeks. Roy had been building towards something for longer. The only thing she hadn't known was what shape it would take. Evelyn Ashcroft was, she had to admit, an elegant shape. Wealthy, respectable, a widow. So she understood loss. She was exactly the kind of woman a town council of 5 men would look at and think, yes, that's the solution. She would restore the appearance of things. She would make the Hale household look the way they thought a household should look. And Clara would disappear back into the category of woman that people were already trying to put her in. She heard Gideon come in from the barn before she saw him. His boots on the step, the particular way he opened the door, not carelessly but with attention, because he'd learned in the past weeks that if the babies were sleeping, you didn't slam anything. He came into the kitchen and looked at her face and stopped. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. "Did you get a letter from the town council?" Something shifted in his expression. He pulled out the other chair and sat down across from her. "I got it this morning. I was trying to figure out how to tell you." "Annie Greer came," Clara said. "She told me." "Clara, tell me what you're thinking," she said. "Actually thinking, not what you think you should say." He was quiet for a moment, his hands flat on the table in front of him. The hands of a man who worked with them, marked with it. "I think the council can mind their own business," he said. "That's what I actually think." "But?" He looked up. "But I also know this isn't going to stop. Roy Pitcher isn't going to stop. And if they push it hard enough, there are things they can do. Legal things. A man without a wife on a homestead, with newborns, and questions about who's living in his house." He stopped. "I'm not saying that to scare you. I'm saying it because I want to be honest with you, the way you've been honest with me from the beginning." "You're saying they could make trouble for you with the land," Clara said. "They could try. They probably won't get anywhere, but they could make the next year very unpleasant and very expensive." He held her gaze. "I'm not going to make any decisions because of that. I'm not going to make you leave because of that. I want to be clear about that." "But you haven't told them to go to hell yet either," Clara said. He didn't deny it. "I wanted to talk to you first, before I said anything to anyone." She appreciated that, or she would appreciate it later, Kit. She could see the effort in it, the consideration it represented. But what she also saw clearly was the hesitation, the space between "I want to defend you" and "I haven't yet." And she understood the space, she understood all the practical reasons for it. But she also felt the weight of standing in it, which was not a comfortable weight to carry. "What does Evelyn Ashcroft want?" Clara asked. "I don't know. I haven't talked to her." "Find out," Clara said. "Before Saturday. Talk to her yourself, not through web. Find out if this is something she actually wants or if she's been arranged into it the way everything else in this has been arranged." Gideon looked at her for a moment. That's a very practical response." "I'm a practical person," Clara said. She got up and went to check on the babies because they'd be waking soon and because she needed to put some space between herself and the kitchen table before she said something that came from the part of her that was not practical at all. He went to see Evelyn Ashcroft on Friday. Clara stayed at the ranch with the twins, and she did not ask herself what she was afraid of because the answer was clear enough that asking seemed redundant. She went through the day's rhythms, feedings, the small washing, the hour in the afternoon when she took the babies outside in the improving spring air and sat with them in the thin sunshine. And she tried not to think about what was being decided in town without her. The thing was, she didn't know what she wanted Gideon to say. That was the honest truth, and she'd gotten into the habit of honesty because it was the only currency she had left that nobody could take. She didn't know what she wanted because what she wanted was complicated in a way she hadn't given herself permission to fully look at yet. She wanted to stay. She knew that. She wanted Noah and Ruby with a fierceness that she understood was not rational and was also not going away. She wanted the evenings by the fire, and the way Gideon's dry, quiet humor caught her off guard, and the particular texture of the life she'd made in the past 6 weeks, which was not perfect and not comfortable, and not anything she'd imagined, but was hers in a way nothing had felt like hers in a long time. She also knew that wanting things had never been sufficient protection against losing them. She knew that better than most. Gideon came back in the late afternoon, while the light was still good, and he came into the house and sat down in the chair with the particular heaviness of someone who had been carrying something all day and was putting it down. "She's a decent woman," he said. "Evelyn Ashcroft. I don't want you to think she's—" "I don't think anything about her," Clara said. "I don't know her. What did she say?" "She said Webb came to her with the idea. She said she didn't refuse because she thought—" He stopped, seemed to choose his words. She said she thought I might genuinely need help, and she was willing to offer it. She wasn't— Another pause. She wasn't assuming anything beyond that. She's not in love with the idea of marrying you, Clara translated. No. He met her eyes. She's a practical woman. She said she'd help if it was needed, but she also said she thought the whole situation was— Her word was managed. She said it felt like someone was managing her toward something she hadn't agreed to. Roy's fingerprints, Clara thought. Everywhere. What did you tell her? Clara asked. I told her I appreciated her honesty and that I didn't need her to take over my household because my household was running fine. A pause. I told her I thought the council was overstepping. And Webb? I haven't talked to Webb yet. He looked at her steadily. I wanted to talk to you first. Again. There was a particular quality in the air between them. Clara was aware of it with the heightened attention of someone who knows a moment is significant while it's happening, which is rarer than people think. Say what you're actually trying to say, she said. Please. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. I'm trying to figure out what you want, because I can go tell the council to stay out of my business, and I will, if that's what you want. But I need to know where you stand. I need to know what you want this to be. The question was bigger than it sounded, and they both knew it. Clara looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up. I want to stay, she said. I want to stay, and I want things to continue the way they've been. I know that's— She exhaled. I know that's not a solution to the talk. I know it doesn't give anyone an answer they're going to be satisfied with, but that's honestly what I want. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Then stay, he said. I'll talk to Webb. I'll make it clear. She nodded, and she thought, we're going to be all right. She thought it the way you think things when you want them badly enough to extend their logic a little further than the evidence supports. She was wrong about that, but she wouldn't know it for another 3 days. The council came Saturday anyway. Gideon had written to Webb on Friday. Clara didn't read the letter, but she understood from his manner when he sealed it that it was direct and final in a way that should have closed the matter. But Webb came anyway, with 2 other council members and Reverend Moss, and they came up the road mid-morning while Clara was in the side yard hanging washing. She saw them coming, and she kept hanging washing, because she was not going to run inside and she was not going to make it easier for them by acting as if she'd done something she needed to hide from. Gideon came out of the barn when he heard horses. He saw them, and then he looked at Clara, and something passed between them, some acknowledgement of the thing that was happening, before he walked toward the gate to meet them. Clara finished pinning the last shirt to the line and came around to stand near the house. Not inside, not at the gate, but close enough to hear and to be seen. The conversation started civil. It always started civil with men like Webb. He had the politician's instinct for maintaining a veneer of courtesy even while doing deeply discourteous things. He said he appreciated that Gideon had written. He respected Gideon's position. He understood these were difficult and personal matters. And then he said the council's concerns remained, and he hoped Gideon would consider, for the sake of the children and for the sake of his reputation in the community, whether the current arrangement was truly in everyone's best interest. Reverend Moss said a few things in support of this. He said them gently, in the voice he used for serious pastoral matters, and he didn't look at Clara directly while he said them, which she found, in a strange way, more offensive than if he had. Clara watched Gideon. This was the thing she had not let herself think about directly, in the days leading up to this. How Gideon would actually hold up when it was real people in front of him, not hypothetical pressure, but the actual faces of men he'd known for years, men whose opinions could make or cost him in the practical commerce of frontier life. Knowing what you believe and holding it steady in front of people who are trying to move it are not the same skill. He held it. For a while. He said clearly and without apology that he appreciated the council's concern and did not share it. He said Clara Whitmore had come to this ranch when no one else would and had kept his children alive, and he was not going to apologize for that or arrange his household differently to satisfy people who hadn't been there. He said it with the flat certainty of a man who had thought it through. Webb let him finish. Then Webb said something Clara would remember for a long time. He said, Gideon, we're not talking about gratitude. We're talking about the future of your children standing in this community. We're talking about what kind of life Noah and Ruby will have when they're old enough to hear what people say about the house they were raised in. You have to think about that. The silence after that was different from the silence before. Clara watched Gideon's face, and she watched the certainty in it move. Not break, not vanish, but shift, a fracture, hairline, and then slightly wider, as the specific cruelty of Webb's argument found the place it had been aimed at. Because it wasn't aimed at Gideon, it was aimed at the twins. It was aimed at the exact place where Gideon could not simply be determined. He didn't agree. He didn't say, all right, she'll go. He just stopped being as certain as he'd been. And Clara could see it, and Webb could see it too, and the silence stretched in a way that asked a question Gideon didn't answer. Webb left it there, smart enough to plant the thing and not stand over it. He said he hoped Gideon would give the matter more consideration and that the council's door was always open, and then they rode back toward town. Clara and Gideon stood in the yard. That was well done, she said finally. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I didn't. He turned to look at her, and his face had that pulled-tight quality she hadn't seen since the very first night. I didn't agree to anything. I know, she said. I'm not going to ask you to leave. I know, she said again. But the thing about silence, about the pause that had opened up in Gideon's certainty, was that you couldn't unhear it once it was there. Clara had watched him hesitate. She had watched Webb's words go into the hesitation and stay there, and she understood, with the particular clarity that comes from having had everything taken away once already, what that meant. It didn't mean Gideon was a bad man. He wasn't. It meant he was a man with children and a life in this community and real, legitimate fears about what that community could do to his son and daughter over years, over decades, in the accumulation of small cruelties that children absorb before they're old enough to understand or resist them. It meant he was afraid for them, and fear for your children was not a thing you argued a person out of. The next 2 days were the hardest of all. Not because anything was said. That was almost the problem. Nothing was said. They moved through the routines of the household with a care that hadn't been there before, a slight distance that both of them were maintaining and both of them were pretending not to maintain. The evenings by the fire were shorter. The conversations were more practical, less like the conversations they'd been. Claire kept waiting for him to say something, to say, I need you to leave or I'm going to marry Evelyn Ashcroft, or I've thought about it, and Webb is right. Any of those things would have been easier than the waiting, which had a quality of slow dread that was harder to carry than any direct blow. He didn't say any of those things. Instead, on Monday evening, he said, I've been thinking about what Webb said. I know, Clara said. I don't agree with him, but I keep thinking about Noah and Ruby, about what school is like for children who have a mark against them before they've done anything to earn it, about how people treat. He stopped. I don't want them to have to carry what this town will put on them if things stay the way they are. Clara set down what she was doing. Gideon, say what you're actually trying to say. He looked at her. In the firelight, his face was difficult to read, or she was struggling to read it because she was afraid of what she'd find. I don't know what to say, he said. That's the honest truth. I don't know what the right thing is. She waited. I think maybe you were right to say what you said before, about wanting things to continue the way they've been. He was picking his words with great care, which was not usually how he spoke, and she noticed that. But I also think that what we want and what's going to happen aren't the same thing, and I don't know how to get from one to the other without hurting. He didn't finish. He looked at the fire. Clara sat with that for a moment. Then she said, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. All right. Do you want me to stay? He turned to look at her. Yes. Then why haven't you said that to Webb? Why haven't you said that to the men at the feed store and the women at the mercantile and Roy Pitcher and whoever else has been in your ear for the last 3 weeks? The silence after that was the longest one yet. And it was the silence, not anything he said, but the specific quality of what he didn't say, that told her everything. Because Gideon Hale was not a man who was slow with words when he knew what he wanted. She'd been watching him for 6 weeks, and she knew this about him. When he was certain, he said it. When he hesitated, it meant he wasn't. He was afraid. She understood the fear and she could not carry it for him and she could not wait inside it indefinitely. She stood up. "I'm going to go to bed," she said. "We can talk more tomorrow." "Clara, we can talk tomorrow," she said again, quietly. And she went to her room and she lay in the dark for a long time looking at the ceiling. She made her decision some time after midnight, in the way that decisions get made in the dark, not dramatically but incrementally, like a balance tipping degree by degree until there's no longer any question of which way it's going to go. She thought about what Webb had said about the twins. She thought about it without Roy Pitcher's spin on it, without the council's condescension, without the Reverend's careful gentleness. She just thought about the plain thing Webb had said, which was that children carry the reputation of the house they're raised in, and that was not nothing. She did not want Noah and Ruby to carry the weight of her presence in their lives, like a brand they hadn't chosen. She also thought about what it meant to stay in a situation where the person you'd begun to depend on had hesitated when it mattered. She knew herself well enough to know she couldn't stay and not feel that hesitation every day, couldn't stay and not eventually become bitter from it, and she did not want to become bitter in this house, in front of these children, at this man who was not a bad man and had not done a bad thing, but simply had not done the one thing that would have changed everything. By morning, she had packed her bag. Gideon came into the kitchen to find her standing by the door with it. His face... She would think about his face later, in the days after, because it showed something that contradicted everything she'd decided in the night, and she had to look away from it to keep her footing. "Don't," he said. "I think it's better," she said. "Clara, I want to talk to you properly. I know last night I wasn't—" "It's better," she said again, "for the twins, for you. And for me, honestly, because I can't—" She stopped, rearranged. "I can't keep doing something that's hurting you without meaning to. You're not hurting me. You're the opposite of Gideon." She said his name with everything she had, which was more than she'd meant to put into it, and she saw him register that. "I need to go. Please, let me go." He stood there. He let her go. She kissed Ruby's forehead while the baby slept, and she touched her hand to Noah's cheek so lightly he didn't wake, and she walked out the door and down the road toward town, and she did not look back because she was not sure she could keep walking if she did. Behind her, the ranch settled into silence. An hour later, Noah woke up hungry. He cried for his feeding, and when Gideon brought Evelyn Ashcroft, summoned by Webb, arriving precisely as planned, to try to comfort him, Noah screamed harder. He screamed until he was hoarse. Ruby woke and joined him. They cried in tandem, that ragged, overlapping sound, and no amount of Evelyn Ashcroft's genuine kindness or Gideon's desperate walking could change the simple physical fact. The person they needed was gone. And the ranch, which had been slowly coming back to life, went quiet in a different way. The way a house goes quiet when something essential has been taken out of it, and everyone in it knows it, even the ones who are too small to have words for what they know. Clara went back to Dorothy's house because there was nowhere else to go, and she hated that, hated the specific humiliation of it, but she was not going to pretend she had options she didn't have. Dorothy opened the door before Clara even knocked. She must have seen her coming up the road, and she stood in the doorway with an expression that was not triumph and not pity, but something exhausted and complicated that Clara recognized as the face her sister made when she'd been worrying about something for a long time, and the thing had finally arrived. "Come in," Dorothy said. "Where's Roy?" Clara asked. "At the hardware store. He won't be back until supper." Dorothy stepped aside. "Come in, Clara, please." Clara came in. She set her bag down in the hall, and she stood there and looked at the house she'd left in the middle of the night 2 months ago and thought about how strange it was that places stayed the same while everything around them changed. The same hook on the wall, the same curtain on the kitchen window, the same smell of wood smoke, and the particular soap Dorothy had always used. Dorothy put the kettle on without asking, and they sat across from each other at the table. And for a little while neither of them said anything, because they were sisters and had their own language of silences. And this silence was the one that meant, we don't need to perform this for each other. "Are you all right?" Dorothy asked finally. "No," Clara said. "But I will be." Dorothy nodded. She had the look of someone preparing to say something she'd been saving. "Roy didn't—" "Clara, I want you to know that I didn't ask him to go out there. When he went to the ranch that time, I found out after." "I know," Clara said. "I should have—" Dorothy stopped, started again. I should have come myself a long time ago. I should have come to see you, to see those babies, and I didn't because Roy—" She pressed her lips together. "Because I let Roy tell me what was proper and what wasn't, and I—" Her voice went unsteady for just a moment before she pulled it back. "I'm sorry for that. I'm actually sorry." Clara looked at her sister, really looked at her, in the way you don't always look at someone you've known your whole life because familiarity makes you see the idea of them rather than the actual person. Dorothy was 31 and looked closer to 40, had looked closer to 40 for the past several years, and the particular aging was not the kind that came from sun and work, but from the inside kind. The kind that came from managing yourself carefully around someone else's moods for a long time. "I know you are," Clara said. "It's all right, Dorothy." "It's not all right," Dorothy said, "but thank you for saying so." The kettle started to sing. Dorothy got up to make the tea, and Clara sat in the chair and felt the particular tiredness of someone who has been holding themselves together with intention and has temporarily run out of intention. It settled into her bones, that tiredness. She thought about Noah and Ruby, and then she stopped thinking about them because she couldn't afford to do that right now, couldn't afford to sit in Dorothy's kitchen and fall apart over two babies she had no claim to. She drank her tea. She helped Dorothy with supper. She was in her room, door closed, when Roy came home, and she heard his voice in the kitchen, a sharp, low exchange with Dorothy that went on for a few minutes before going quiet. And she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall and thought, one day at a time. It was the only math that worked. Oh, shit. The first day was bad. The second was worse. The milk was the problem. Again, always, her body with its relentless biological memory. But it was different this time because the last 2 months had deepened it, strengthened it, and her body had been reliably feeding 2 infants every few hours for long enough that the absence was not just uncomfortable, but physically acute. She dealt with it privately, as she had before, and she did not let herself think about why it was worse this time, because that path led somewhere she couldn't afford to go. She found work. That was the first practical thing. Mrs. Hollis at the laundry took her back without ceremony or warmth, but also without cruelty, which was all Clara asked of it, and she started work on Thursday morning 3 days after leaving the ranch, and she was grateful for the physical demand of it, the way the work filled the hours and exhausted her body enough that sleep came even when her mind resisted. The town looked at her the way it had always looked at her, with that particular attention that wasn't quite friendly and wasn't quite hostile, but was always aware. She'd been away from town for 2 months doing something everyone had opinions about, and now she was back, and people watched to see how she would carry it. She carried it the same way she'd carried everything else. Chin level, eyes forward, not performing dignity but simply not abandoning it. Roy left her alone mostly. He'd gotten what he wanted, Clara out of the Hale household, and he was the kind of man who lost interest in a problem once it had resolved in his direction. He said nothing to her directly, and she said nothing to him, and they existed in the same house with the careful mutual avoidance of two people who had a clear understanding of each other and no desire to deepen it. Annie Greer came to see her on Saturday, at the laundry, and this time there was no pretense of a social errand. "How are you?" Annie asked, and the directness of it, no preamble, no softening, was what Clara liked most about her. "Working," Clara said, "which is good. Have you heard anything? From the ranch?" Clara kept her hands moving through the washing. "No, I have," Annie said carefully, "from my mother, who heard from Mrs. Callan." A pause. "The babies aren't doing well, Clara." Clara's hands went still in the water. "Mrs. Ashcroft has been going out every day," Annie continued. "She's trying, from what I hear. She's not an unkind woman, but the babies won't settle. Noah isn't eating properly, and Ruby has been crying most of the day and night, and Gideon—" Annie stopped. "My mother said Mrs. Callan said that Gideon looks like a man who's coming apart." Clara stood at the washboard with her wet hands, and the feeling she had was one of the most complicated she'd ever had, which was no small thing given the last 8 months of her life. It was grief and guilt, and something fiercer than either of those, something that was not quite anger and not quite love, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. "That's not my fault," she said. It came out more like she was saying it to herself than to Annie. "No," Annie agreed. "It's not. I can't go back just because it's hard for them without me. That's not a reason. That's just—" "I know," Annie said. I'm not saying you should. I'm just telling you what I heard. Clara went back to the washing. Her hands were cold in the water. She was quiet for a long time, and Annie stayed, not pushing, and finally Clara said, "How bad is it, honestly?" Annie's face told her before Annie's words did. Mrs. Callan said Noah hadn't kept a feeding down in 2 days. She didn't go back. Not on Saturday, not on Sunday. She made the decision not to go back the way she'd made the decision to leave. In the dark, alone, turning it over until she understood all its edges. She made the decision because going back meant that every time things got hard in the future, someone would know they could arrange for Clara to leave, and then arrange for her to return, and she would come, like a woman without the ability to hold a position. She made the decision because Gideon had hesitated, and that hesitation had told her something she had to respect even when it hurt, and she couldn't unknow it. She made the decision, and then she went to work on Monday morning, and went home on Monday evening, and lay in bed on Monday night listening to the quiet of Dorothy's house, and thought about Noah not eating and Ruby crying. Tuesday she woke at 4 in the morning and lay there until 5, and then got up and put on her dress and her coat and picked up her bag. Not packed, just the bag she hadn't unpacked because she'd known, somewhere she hadn't admitted to herself, that she might need it. And she sat at the kitchen table in the dark and did not move. She was still sitting there when she heard hoofbeats in the road outside. Fast, like someone riding with purpose. She heard them slow at the house, and then a knock at the door. Not the door of someone unsure they should be knocking, but the knock of someone who had ridden hard and was not interested in patience. She opened the door before Dorothy could come downstairs. Gideon was on the step. He had ridden in the dark, and his coat was dusty, and his face had the specific look she'd seen the very first night. The stripped-down, no more pretense look of a man with nothing left to spend on appearances. His horse stood at the gate with her sides still heaving. He looked at Clara. He looked at the bag in her hand. "You were coming," he said. "I don't know," she said. "I was sitting." He let out a breath that was not quite a laugh. He put his hand on the door frame, not reaching for her, just steadying himself. "Noah's lost weight again. Ruby won't stop. Mrs. Ashcroft is... She's kind, and she's trying, and it doesn't matter. It's not... They need you. I need you to come back." "Gideon..." "Wait," he said. "I'm not done." She waited. He ran a hand over his face, and she could see how exhausted he was, how the days since she'd left had taken their toll, and she recognized the exhaustion because it was the kind that went past sleep deprivation into something more fundamental. "I stood in that yard when Webb came," he said, "and I said the right things, and I meant them, and then Webb talked about the twins, and something got into me. I started thinking about things that might happen years from now to children who are 8 weeks old, and I let that take me somewhere I shouldn't have gone." He paused. "And you saw it. You saw me hesitate, and you left because of it, and you were right to. I'm not arguing that." She didn't say anything. "But I'm going to say the thing I should have said in that yard," he continued, and his voice shifted, went steadier, the way it did when he was saying something he'd decided on. "I want you at that ranch, not because of the twins, not because you're useful or necessary, or because nobody else will do, because I want you there. Because the past 6 weeks have been... because you're the first person I've wanted to talk to at the end of a day since Margaret died. And that is not something I take lightly, and it's not something I'm willing to arrange away just because Edmund Webb is concerned about appearances." She said. The door at the top of the stairs opened. Dorothy appeared in her robe, looking down at them with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite managing it. Roy appeared behind her. His face was the opposite of neutral. "Hail," Roy said from the top of the stairs. "It's 5 in the morning." "I know what time it is," Gideon said without looking away from Clara. "Whatever you think you're doing..." "Roy..." Dorothy's voice, quiet, had something in it that Clara had never heard before. A finality. A drawing of a line. Roy stopped. Clara and Gideon looked at each other in the doorway with the first gray light of morning coming up behind him. "You let me walk out," she said. "Not accusation, just fact." "I know," he said. "I'm here now." "That's not the same thing." "No," he agreed. "It's not. But it's what I have." His jaw was set the way she recognized, the look of a man who had thought something through and arrived somewhere he wasn't going to be moved from. Come back. Come back and we'll figure out the rest. I'll tell Webb whatever needs to be told. I'll tell every person in this county who cares to listen. But I need you to come back first, because my children are sick, and I can't fix it, and you're the only person who can. And beyond that, a pause. Quiet. Beyond all of that, I don't want to do this without you. The silence after that was different from every other silence they'd had. From the top of the stairs, Roy made a sound that was beginning a sentence, and Dorothy said his name again. Just his name, 2 letters, the quietest she'd ever said anything. And he didn't finish the sentence. Let me get my coat, Clara said. They rode back in the early morning, the sky going from gray to pale gold ahead of them, and neither of them talked much on the ride, partly because they were both tired and partly because the talking was done, the important part of it, and what remained was just the riding. Clara was aware of Gideon beside her with the specific awareness of someone who had been trying not to be too aware of a person for several weeks and had now given up the effort. She was aware of his breathing and the way he sat a horse, and the fact that he kept glancing at her the way people glance at something they've been afraid they might have lost. They arrived at the ranch as the sun cleared the horizon. Evelyn Ashcroft was in the main room with both babies, Ruby in her arms, Noah in the cradle, and the sound that met them at the door was not silence but its precursor, that specific quality of a lull in a long storm where everything is braced for the next wave. Evelyn looked up when they came in. She looked at Clara, and her expression was the most honest thing Clara had seen from a stranger in a long time, pure, unguarded relief. "Thank you," Evelyn said simply. "I'm sorry," Clara said. "I know this has been—" "Don't apologize," Evelyn said. She stood carefully and brought Ruby to Clara with the precision of someone handing over something irreplaceable. And Ruby, who had been making the low keening sound of a baby past ordinary crying, went into Clara's arms, and the sound stopped so completely that all 3 adults stood in the sudden quiet of it, blinking. Ruby pressed her face against Clara's neck and made a small, exhausted, contented sound, and Clara closed her eyes for a moment and held her and breathed. Noah heard it, or smelled it, or felt the particular atmospheric change of her presence, whatever sense a baby uses that is not the named senses, but something older and more specific. And his crying shifted in the cradle, went from distressed to expectant. "Come here," Clara said, and she sat in the rocking chair and took them both, Ruby against one side and Noah transferred from Evelyn's arms to her other, and she fed them while Gideon stood in the doorway between the main room and the kitchen, with his arms crossed and his face arranged in a way that was trying to be composed and was not quite succeeding. Evelyn sat across the room, and after a moment she said in a conversational tone, "I told Webb this was a mistake. 3 days ago. I told him quite clearly that this arrangement was not solving anything and was in fact making things significantly worse, and he told me to give it more time." She paused. "I've never been fond of being told to give something more time when the evidence is plainly in front of me." "What did he say to that?" Gideon asked. "He said women were too emotional to assess situations clearly." She said it with the calm of someone who had been hearing that particular argument for decades and had stopped finding it worth engaging with. "I told him that was an interesting position for a man who'd just watched 2 infants slowly starve to take." Another pause. "He didn't enjoy that, despite everything, the exhaustion and the complicated residue of the past 5 days. Clara felt something loosen in her chest at that, something almost like laughter. "You don't have to stay," Gideon told Evelyn. "You've done more than—" "I'll stay through breakfast," Evelyn said, with the particular tone of a woman who had decided something and was not interested in being argued out of it. "And then I'm going to go have a conversation with Edmund Webb that he has had coming for quite some time." She did stay through breakfast. She made it, in fact, moved through the kitchen with the competence of a woman who ran a large property alone and knew how to feed people efficiently. And they ate in the main room because neither baby was willing to be set down, and so Clara ate one-handed with Ruby in her other arm, and nobody made a thing of it. It was, in its strange way, one of the more comfortable breakfasts Clara had eaten in recent memory. When Evelyn left, she paused at the door and looked at Clara with an expression that was frank and a little complicated and entirely without malice. "I hope things go well for you here," she said. "Genuinely. I'll tell anyone who asks that those children couldn't be better cared for. A slight pause. And I'll tell Edmund Webb the same thing, in considerably more detail. The door closed behind her. Gideon leaned against the wall and let out a long breath. Clara was in the chair with the sleeping Noah against her shoulder, and Ruby beginning to drift in her arms, and the morning light was coming through the kitchen window at the angle it came through every morning, and the fire was low but still warm, and everything was not fixed, not resolved, not clean, but present, real. Here. Clara, Gideon said. Don't, she said. Not yet. Let them sleep first. He nodded. He came and sat across from her, not close, just in the other chair, and they were quiet together the way they'd been quiet in the early weeks before everything had gotten complicated. Except it was different now because they both knew what the quiet meant, and neither of them was pretending they didn't. The twins slept. The fire settled. Outside, the spring morning continued. Quote, she had thought, if she was honest, she had hoped, in the guarded way she'd allowed herself to hope things since November, that his coming for her would be the resolution, that riding back in the early morning would be the end of the hard part. She knew better, of course. She knew how the world worked well enough to know that one man riding through the dark to say the right words didn't change what a town had decided about a woman. But she had hoped, quietly, that it might be the beginning of the end of it. What she hadn't expected was that the shift would be as public as it was, or as sudden. It happened 4 days after she came back on a Friday in the main street of town. She had gone to the mercantile for supplies, a routine trip, the same trip she'd made every week for 2 months, with the same awareness of how the room changed when she walked into it. She got what she needed, and she was at the counter with Mrs. Callan when Gideon came through the door. He'd ridden in separately. He had business at the feed store, and Clara had not expected to see him, but there he was, and behind him, apparently having arrived at precisely the same moment, were Edmund Webb and Reverend Moss. It was, Clara thought, the specific kind of bad timing that was actually not bad timing at all, but the frontier equivalent of running out of road. Webb saw her first. His expression settled into the particular arrangement of a man deciding how to handle a situation. And then he saw Gideon, and his expression became the arrangement of a man who had decided the situation required an audience. "Hail," Webb said. "I'd hoped to speak with you." "I expect you had," Gideon said. "About the matter we discussed. Now that Mrs. Ashcroft has—" "Mrs. Ashcroft was a bad idea," Gideon said. He said it plainly, without heat, the way he said things when he'd decided them. "My children lost weight while she was there. They're recovering now. Be that as it may, the council's position? Edmund." He used his first name, which stopped Webb mid-sentence. "I'm going to say something, and I need you to hear it clearly, because I'm going to say it once." The mercantile had gone quiet around them in the way that small-town spaces go quiet when something is happening. Not a performance of quiet, but the genuine suspended attention of people who have stopped pretending to do other things. "Miss Whitmore came to my ranch in the middle of December when my children were 12 hours from not making it," Gideon said. "She walked 3 miles in the dark to do it. She had just lost her own daughter 2 months before." His voice didn't waver. "She has spent 6 weeks keeping my family alive, and what she got for it was this town deciding to have opinions about her character." He looked at Webb directly. "I'm done accommodating those opinions." Webb started to say something. Gideon kept talking. "I'm going to ask Clara Whitmore to marry me," he said. "And if she says yes, we are going to be married as soon as it can be arranged. And if anyone in this town has something to say about that, they can say it to me directly, not to her, not through Roy Pitcher, not through the council or the Reverend or anyone else. To me." He turned and looked at Clara. She was standing out of the counter with her supplies in her hands, and her face had done something she hadn't given it permission to do, which was show everything. She felt it, the exposure of it, and she didn't try to put the composure back because what was the point? There wasn't a person in the room who wasn't already watching. Gideon crossed the space between them. He didn't look around at anyone else. He was looking at her. "I should have said this in that yard," he said, lower now, just for her. "I know I should have. I know that doesn't fix the days in between." He stopped. "Clara, will you marry me? Not because the twins need you, not because the town needs a satisfying resolution to their story, because I have spent 6 weeks becoming a better version of myself in your vicinity, and I don't want to stop." She looked at him. She looked at his face, which she knew well enough now to see the effort in it, and the certainty behind the effort, and the fact that the certainty had arrived through difficulty rather than by default. "You made me wait 5 days," she said. "I know. I walked 3 miles in the dark for you, and you let me walk away." "I know," he said again. She held his gaze for a moment, long enough to see that he did in fact know, that he wasn't brushing it aside, that he was holding it the way it deserved to be held. "Yes," she said. Something moved through his face, relief, and something that lived underneath relief, something quieter and less articulable. Behind them, Mrs. Callan made a sound. Clara couldn't tell what kind. Reverend Moss cleared his throat. Webb said nothing at all, which was perhaps the most surprised she'd seen him look. Gideon looked around the room then, took it in, all of them, all the faces of people who'd been talking about Clara Whitmore for months. And he said, calmly and finally, "I'd appreciate it if everyone in this room understood that this family is not up for discussion anymore." He picked up Clara's supplies from the counter because her hands had forgotten they were holding them, and he held the door open for her, and they walked out into the main street of town together in the bright spring morning. She made it about 10 steps before she had to stop. She stopped and she put her hand over her mouth, and she stood there on the main street of town for a moment with the sun on her face. Not crying. She was done with crying, she thought. She was profoundly tired of crying. Just stopping, just breathing, just absorbing the fact that something she had stopped allowing herself to want had happened anyway. Gideon stopped beside her. He didn't ask if she was all right because he could see she was, and he could see she wasn't, and he seemed to understand that both things were true at once. "Do you want to walk a minute?" he asked. "Yes," she said. They walked, down the main street and around the side road that curved past the milliners and back toward where the horses were hitched. They didn't talk for most of it, just walked side by side in the warming spring air with the new green coming up in the verges and the mud of winter slowly firming underfoot. "I was sitting at Dorothy's kitchen table," Clara said when they reached the horses. "This morning when you came, I'd gotten up at 4 and I was sitting there with my bag and I hadn't decided anything yet." "I know," Gideon said. "You told me." "I was going to come back," she said. "I think. I hadn't let myself admit it yet, but I was going to." She looked at her horse's ear, a safer thing to look at than his face for this particular admission. "I couldn't not." She heard him exhale. "Yeah," he said. "Me neither." They rode back to the ranch in the late morning, and the light was good, and the road was better than it had been in winter, and the whole county was doing that tentative spring thing where everything was still a little gray, but you could see where the green was going to come. It was not a perfect morning. Clara's neck ached from the angle she'd held the babies in, and she was tired in her bones from the past week, and she knew that Roy Pitcher was going to be furious, and that the town was not going to stop talking simply because Gideon had told them to, and that whatever came next was going to require the same tenacity that everything before it had required. She knew all of that. She held it clearly, without flinching from it. And she rode back toward the ranch where 2 babies were waiting, and a life was waiting, and the man riding beside her had chosen her, not her sacrifice, but her, in front of witnesses who would carry it back to every corner of the county before nightfall. And she let herself feel that without immediately looking for the catch. For once, just for the length of that ride, she let herself have the thing without calculating how long it would last. The ranch came into view around the bend. The barn, the house, the fence line, the new green just barely coming up in the field beyond. The same sight she'd ridden toward the first time, in the dark, alone, with nothing but a bag and a decision. Completely different now. Completely the same. She rode through the gate. She was home. They were married on a Thursday, 12 days after Gideon's proposal in the Mercantile. It was not the wedding either of them would have planned, if planning had been a luxury available to them. There was no elaborate dress. Clara wore the good blue wool she'd brought in her bag the night she walked to the ranch, the same bag she'd carried twice now, and she thought there was something fitting in that, though she couldn't have said exactly what. There were no flowers, because it was still too early in the spring for the kind that meant something, and there were no decorations in the small room at the county clerk's office, where the ceremony was performed by a justice of the peace named Harold Birch, who had a kind face and the brisk efficiency of a man who had officiated many weddings, and understood that people came to them carrying many different things. Annie Greer was there because Clara had asked her and because Annie had said yes before Clara finished the sentence. Evelyn Ashcroft came as well, which surprised Clara until she thought about it, and then it didn't surprise her at all. Evelyn had the specific independence of a woman who had stopped caring about the optics of her associations sometime in her 30s and had been considerably happier since. She stood in the back of the small room with her hands folded and her expression composed and warm. Gideon had two ranch hands he'd known for years, brothers named Cal and Pete Dunmore, who came in their good shirts and stood beside him with the slightly formal discomfort of men trying to be appropriate to an occasion. The twins were there too, because there was no one to leave them with, and because Clara would not have wanted to leave them anyway. Ruby slept through the entire ceremony in the crook of Clara's left arm. Noah was awake, looking at the ceiling with the focused attention of a baby who has recently discovered that the world contains things to look at, his small face moving through a private sequence of expressions that had nothing to do with weddings and everything to do with being 3 months old. Harold Birch said his words. Gideon said his. Clara said hers, clearly, without wavering, because she'd spent enough time wavering in the past months that she was done with it now on this particular subject. When it was finished, when Harold Birch said the thing that made it official, and Cal Dunmore let out a small, genuine whoop that echoed off the ceiling and made Ruby stir without quite waking, Gideon looked at Clara with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not happiness exactly, or not only happiness. Something quieter and more durable. The expression of a man who has been through enough to know the difference between a good day and a good life and has just done something that belongs in the second category. He kissed her. Briefly, a little awkward, because he was still learning the edges of this, and so was she, and Ruby chose that precise moment to wake up and make her presence known with considerable volume, which caused a general laugh and dissolved whatever formality had been building. Good timing, Gideon said to Ruby. He took her from Clara's arm with the practiced ease he'd developed over weeks of doing it, and Ruby, having made her point, settled. They went back to the ranch. Annie came for the afternoon, and they had a meal that was not a feast, but was real food cooked by people who knew what they were doing. And they sat around the table in the main room and talked without the specific weight that had been on everything for the past months. And it was the most ordinary few hours Clara had had in longer than she could clearly remember. Ordinary, she had learned, was not a small thing. Roy Pitcher had his say, of course. He came to the ranch the week after the wedding, alone this time, without the council behind him, which meant this was personal rather than civic. And Clara answered the door because Gideon was in the south field, and she was not going to pretend she wasn't home. Roy looked at her on the doorstep, and she looked at Roy, and they both understood that this conversation had been coming since November, since before November, since the first time he'd looked at Clara across the dinner table with that expression, and she'd understood what she was to him. You've made your choices, Roy said. Not cruel, not warm, just stating. I have, Clara said. Dorothy asked me to come. He said it in a way that made it hard to know if it was true. Dorothy can come herself if she wants to talk to me, Clara said. He was quiet for a moment, looking past her into the house. She didn't move aside to give him a view, and she didn't close the door further, just stood in it. I hope you know what you've gotten into, he said finally. A man with 2 babies and a reputation for bad judgment. Roy, Clara said, and the way she said it was not angry, just final. The same quality Dorothy's voice had had on the stairs that morning, the 2-letter word that closed a door. I'm not going to stand at my own door and listen to you talk about my husband. If there's something you came to say to me, say it directly. He looked at her. For just a moment she saw something move behind his eyes. Not remorse exactly, not the kind of men like Roy were capable of, but something adjacent to it. Something that knew on some level that the story he'd been telling about Clara Whitmore was not the true story, and had never been, and that the telling of it had cost something. I need you to know, he said, and then he stopped. Tried again. Your sister misses you. Clara looked at him steadily. Then she knows where I live. He left. Dorothy came 2 weeks later without Roy, on a Tuesday afternoon when the spring had finally committed to being spring and the fields beyond the fence were showing real color. She came alone on the wagon and she knocked at the door, and when Clara opened it, they stood looking at each other for a moment before Dorothy said, I brought some things. Some things from your mother's. I thought you might want them here." She had a small box. A few items that had been their mother's, divided up when she died, that had been sitting in Dorothy's spare room for the past years, because Clara had been moving and hadn't had a permanent place to put them. Clara took the box and said, "Come in." Dorothy came in. She met Noah and Ruby and held them with a carefully maintained composure that Clara could see was covering something softer, and she had coffee and looked around the house with the eyes of someone revising a picture they'd been given by someone else. "It's a good house," Dorothy said. "It is," Clara agreed. "He seems," Dorothy started. "He's a good man," Clara said. Not defensively, just clearly. Dorothy nodded. She drank her coffee and they talked about careful things. The farm, the weather, some news from up county that Clara had missed. And when she left, she hugged Clara at the door with more than the usual force, and Clara hugged her back, and neither of them said anything about Roy or the past months or the things that should have been different, because there was a particular mercy in leaving some things unsaid when both people already knew them. Dorothy came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. The talk in town took longer than the weeks it took for Dorothy to come around. The talk in town was a different creature, less individual than Dorothy and Roy, more distributed, harder to pin down and address directly. It didn't stop when Gideon made his speech in the Mercantile. It didn't stop when the wedding notice appeared in the small paper. It continued because talk like that is not about the facts of a situation, but about the story a community has committed to. And communities do not reverse their stories quickly or gracefully. Clara knew this. She had lived in small places long enough to know that the version of you the town has decided on will outlast the evidence against it by quite a bit. She also knew that the only reliable counter to it was time and presence, the slow accumulation of days in which you simply exist as you are, and let the evidence pile up quietly until the story can't hold its shape anymore. So she existed as she was. She went to the Mercantile and she was civil to Mrs. Callan, and she did not pretend the coolness wasn't there. But she also did not make a performance of it. She went to the laundry once a week, not to work anymore, now that she was managing the household, but to pay what she owed Mrs. Hollis, because she'd borrowed money against her wages in the last week before she went back to the ranch, and she was going to pay it back every cent because her debts were her debts. She was kind to the people who were kind to her and neutral to the people who weren't, and she did not go out of her way to make anyone comfortable at the expense of her own dignity. And she did not make speeches or defend herself publicly because Gideon had already made the speech, and adding her voice to it would look like protest, and she wasn't protesting, she was living. Gideon dealt with the men, the ones at the feed store, and the ones at the farm supply, and he dealt with them in the specific way that men deal with community resistance on the frontier, which was to be so relentlessly competent and steady and present that the resistance had nothing concrete to attach itself to. His cattle came through the spring in good shape. His fences were maintained. His operation ran the way a well-managed ranch ran, and that spoke a language the county understood, regardless of what it thought about the domestic arrangements at the Hale house. Edmund Webb said nothing more about the matter. Whether Evelyn Ashcroft had said something to him that ended his interest, or whether the marriage itself had resolved the concern he claimed to have had, Clara didn't know and didn't particularly want to know. She simply noted his silence and filed it away as one less thing. What she had not expected, what turned out to be the thing that moved the town more than any speech or demonstration, was the twins. Noah and Ruby at 4 months were different creatures from the screaming, starving newborns who'd kept the county up with their reputation. They were solid now, round-cheeked, with the particular quality of babies who had been well-fed and well-held and had figured out that the world was a fairly reliable place. They had personalities. Noah was solemn and watchful, a baby who studied faces with the intensity of someone collecting data. Ruby was loud and social, reached for anyone who came near, had discovered her own voice and was using it constantly. When Clara brought them into town, things happened. Women who had been cool to Clara found themselves unable to maintain the coolness while a baby reached for them with both fists. Men who had nodded curtly at Gideon for weeks found themselves crouching to make faces at Noah, who would study them with grave attention and occasionally reward them with a slow, incredulous smile. Children were the most direct. They gathered around the wagon when Clara brought the twins to town, and the questions they asked were entirely without the social calculations of their parents. And Clara answered them simply, and the children went away satisfied. It was not grand. It was not a conversion. It was just the steady, quiet work of being present until presence became normal, and it took months, not weeks, and there were days in it that were harder than others. But it happened. The summer came and then moved toward fall, and the ranch changed shape along with the seasons. The Dunmore brothers, Cal and Pete, became fixtures. Not just hired hands, but people who came for Sunday meals and fixed things that needed fixing and occasionally stayed too late talking around the table. Cal was 24 and had opinions about cattle that rivaled Gideon's, and the two of them could argue about grazing rotation for longer than Clara thought any two humans should be willing to spend on the subject. Pete was quieter, 17 and still working out who he was, and he had a way with the twins that surprised everyone, including himself. He'd pick up whichever one was fussing with a natural ease and walk them until they settled, completely unself-conscious about it. And Clara watched this and thought about how people contain things they don't know about until the situation calls for it. Annie Greer came for dinner twice a month and eventually just came on Sundays because it had become the shape of things. And she and Clara talked the way women talk when they trust each other, which is to say they talked about everything, including the things that were hard. Annie was working out her own situation. There was a young man in the county she was uncertain about, and she talked around him and then at him and then asked Clara what she thought. And Clara said the only thing she knew how to say about it, which was, trust what the person does when it costs them something. Anyone can do the right thing when it's easy. Gideon overheard that from the kitchen doorway, and he didn't say anything, but he caught Clara's eye across the room and she looked at him and looked away. And that was its own small, complete conversation. In August, Clara realized she was pregnant. She sat with the knowledge for 3 days before she told Gideon, not because she was afraid to tell him, but because she needed 3 days to come to her own relationship with it first. The last time she'd been pregnant, she had lost Eliza. The time before that, there had been no after. She had been unmarried and alone, and that situation had resolved itself in a way she'd never told anyone about, because it was hers, and because the past was the past, and she'd carried it the way she carried everything else, forward one day. This was different. She knew it was different. She also knew, with the particular realism of someone who had experienced the worst, that knowing it was different did not make the fear go away. The fear was there. She sat with the fear for 3 days, named it, looked at it, and then she went and found Gideon in the barn where he was working a harness, and she said, "I'm pregnant." He put down the harness. He looked at her with the directness that she'd always appreciated about him, the way he looked at things he considered important. "How are you feeling about it?" he asked. Not "that's wonderful," not "oh, Clara," just "how are you feeling about it?" "Scared," she said, "and glad." He nodded. He came across the barn and he put his arms around her and she let him, let herself be held without the usual slight instinct toward independence that she'd spent years developing as a survival skill. They stood in the barn for a minute, just that, and then she straightened and stepped back, and he let her. "We'll be careful," he said. "We'll be careful," she agreed. "That's all we can do." It was not a vow. It was not a promise that the world would cooperate. It was just an honest statement of what they had, which was care and intention, and each other, and Clara had learned that those things were more than they sounded like. She was careful. She rested when her body asked for it, which was new. She had never in her adult life been particularly inclined toward rest, and she ate well, and she let Gideon do more of the physical work through the fall, without the guilt about it that she would have felt before. Dorothy came every Tuesday and helped with the twins, who at 7 months were sitting up and had recently discovered crawling and were exploring the ranch with a relentless curiosity that required constant attention. The pregnancy was not easy. She was sick in the early months, sicker than she'd been with Eliza. And there were days when the fear came back in its full force, and she held it and breathed through it and got up again. There were nights when she lay awake calculating the distance between this pregnancy and what had happened before, trying to identify what would be different, trying to find the detail that would promise her a different outcome. Gideon knew she did this. He didn't try to talk her out of the fear or reassure her that everything would be fine, because he was not a man who made promises about things outside his control, and she didn't want him to be. What he did was stay close in the particular way she'd come to understand as his version of comfort, present, steady, available, not intrusive. He slept with his hand near hers on cold nights, and she was aware of that warmth in the dark, and it helped more than she could have explained. Lillian was born in April. The labor was long, 20 hours, long enough that Gideon's composure, usually reliable, showed significant strain around the edges. And it was not easy, and there were hours in the middle of it when Clara, in the grip of something bigger than her, stopped being able to assess whether it was going well, and simply had to be in it. The midwife was a woman named Grace Parrish, who had been practicing for 30 years and had the unflappable quality of someone who had seen every version of this and trusted the process while also being ready to act if the process required it. At 2 in the afternoon on the 14th of April, Lillian came into the world loud and furious and pink, and Grace Parrish put her on Clara's chest and said, "That's a healthy girl," with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who knew what she was talking about. Clara held her daughter against her chest and felt the specific weight of her, heavier than Eliza had been, fuller, a different quality of aliveness. And she didn't try to manage what she felt. She just held her and wept, and she didn't apologize for the weeping, and she didn't try to explain what was in it, which was relief and grief, and something past both of them that didn't have a name. Gideon was in the doorway. Grace had sent him out for the hard part, and he'd come back when she said he could, and he stood in the doorway now with a face that had been through something. "Come here," Clara said. He came. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Lillian with the same expression he'd had at the wedding. That quiet, durable thing. "She's healthy?" he said to Grace. "Very," Grace said. She was already cleaning up with the efficiency of someone who had 3 more calls to make that week. He looked at Clara. "And you?" "Tired," Clara said. "But here." He put his hand over hers on the blanket. Just that, just the weight of it. And they stayed like that for a while Lillian slept on Clara's chest with the unconscious authority of someone who has just arrived and expects the world to organize itself accordingly. Roy Pitcher left Dorothy the following winter. He didn't leave graciously or with the generosity of a man who understood what he was relinquishing. He left because he had found another situation in the next county, another woman, another household, another place where his particular talent for making himself the center of things could start fresh. And he told Dorothy on a Thursday morning and was gone by Friday. Dorothy showed up at the ranch on Saturday with 2 trunks and a face that was doing the hard work of not collapsing, and Clara opened the door and looked at her sister and said, "Come in. Stay as long as you need." "I don't want to impose," Dorothy started. "Dorothy," Clara said, "just the name. Come in." She came in. The following weeks were not easy ones. Dorothy was not a woman who fell apart easily. She'd had too much practice holding herself together. But she fell apart in pieces, in small moments that she'd sometimes lose control of at unexpected times, at breakfast or while hanging laundry or sitting with Lillian in her arms, and Clara let it happen without trying to hurry it, because grief for a marriage, even a bad marriage, even one you were relieved to be free of, was still grief, and it had its own schedule. Gideon gave Dorothy the small room off the kitchen, the room Clara had slept in that first winter, with the boxes and the broken chair long since cleared out, and he was decent to her with the uncomplicated decency of a man who understood that decency didn't require liking someone's situation, just respecting the person in it. Cal Dunmore was kind to her in a way that was slightly more than general kindness, and Clara noticed this and said nothing, because some things needed room to develop without people noticing them to death. What Dorothy had not expected, what she said to Clara one evening in the kitchen while Gideon was outside and the babies were in bed, was how it felt to be in a house where a man and a woman were kind to each other as a matter of course. "I'd forgotten," Dorothy said. She was quiet for a moment. "I'd forgotten that was something that could just happen, regularly, without—" She stopped. "Without managing it," Clara said. "Yes." Dorothy looked at her hands. "Was it always like this with him? With Gideon?" Clara thought about the right way to answer that, which was not the simple way. "No," she said. "It wasn't always. There were things that needed working through, and we worked through them, and some of it was hard." She paused. "But the basic thing, the way he is, that was always there. I saw it the first night." Dorothy nodded slowly. I think I picked someone who wasn't that, she said. I think I knew, somewhere, and I talked myself out of knowing. Clara looked at her sister. Yes, she said, I think you did. And I think you know the difference now, which is something. It wasn't comfort exactly, but it was honest, and Dorothy had always been better served by honest than by comfort, even if she'd accepted comfort because it was offered more often. The ranch in its third year was a different creature from the struggling, grief-battered place Clara had walked into in December 3 years before. The cattle operation had expanded, not dramatically, not recklessly, but in the steady, deliberate way of a man who understood the land he was working and didn't try to force it past its capacity. Gideon had added 20 head in the spring and had plans for a second barn that Pete Dunmore was going to help build over the summer. The house itself had been enlarged. An additional room for Lillian, and a proper bedroom for Dorothy that was more than a storage room with a bed pushed into it. The county knew the Hale Ranch now, not because of the stories that had circulated that first winter. Though those stories had not been entirely forgotten, stories like that never are, but because of the operation itself, because of what Gideon had built and was building. Men came to him for advice on cattle that they would not have sought 3 years ago, and Clara understood this to be its own kind of answer. The kind that didn't require speeches. Noah and Ruby were toddlers. This was its own ongoing event. Noah, at 2.5, was the child who found every tool Gideon put down and relocated it to somewhere it was not. Not maliciously, but with the cheerful curiosity of a boy who thought everything in the world was potentially for him. Ruby was louder than Noah, and faster than she should have been at her age, and had recently learned to climb, which had introduced a new category of problem into the daily management of the household that Clara was not sure had a permanent solution. They were, both of them, exactly themselves, distinct and opinionated and exhausting and funny in the unselfconscious way that small children are funny, without meaning to and therefore without limit. Clara loved them with a love that was not complicated anymore. It had been complicated once, threaded through with guilt about her own needs and grief for Eliza, and the sense that she had no right to feel so completely that they were hers. But time and the specific dailiness of raising children had worn the complication down to its foundation, which was simply love, the kind that doesn't require justification. Eliza she still carried. That had not changed, and she did not expect it to change. Grief for a child, she had come to understand, was not something that resolved. It was something you learned to carry without letting the weight of it prevent you from moving. There were still mornings when she would look at Lillian in the early light. That particular face that was Gideon's jaw and her own eyes and nobody else, and think of the face she'd had 3 hours to memorize, and the grief would be there, clean and honest and hers. She did not hide it. She had told Gideon about Eliza in full one night in the fall of their first year together, told him not the outline she'd offered before, but the real version. The 3 hours, the counting of fingers, the believing it was over, the not understanding for a long time after how it had happened when she'd been so sure. He had listened the way he listened to things that mattered without rushing to fill the silence or find the correct consoling words, and when she finished, he'd said, "Thank you for telling me that." And she had understood that he understood what it had cost her to say it. He told her about Margaret too, in similar installments over that same first year. Not the version he gave to people who asked, the brief and factual account of a birth that went wrong, but the longer version, the one that had a specific weight to it. Clara had listened the same way he'd listened to her, and they had done something that she thought was rarer than people admitted. They had made room for the people they'd lost without letting those people become a wall between them. The thing Clara understood, by the time Lillian was learning to walk, and Noah had progressed from relocating tools to attempting to use them under supervision, and Ruby had learned that climbing the fence was permitted, but climbing the barn was not, was something she couldn't have been told beforehand, even if someone had tried. She understood that the life she had now was not a consolation prize for the life she'd lost. It was not a substitute, not a second best, not a making do. It was itself, its own specific, imperfect, irreplaceable thing, built out of the exact materials that had been available. A cold night, and a walk through the dark, and 2 screaming babies, and a man who had hesitated and then come through the dark to knock on a door. She thought about this sometimes when the ranch was quiet, in the particular quiet of a house where children have finally gone to sleep and the adults are allowed to have silence. She thought about the version of herself who had lain in Dorothy's spare room in December 3 years ago, looking at the ceiling with nothing. No baby, no home, no money, no clear sense of a future. And she did not feel sorry for that woman in the way that implies the suffering was wasted. The suffering had not been wasted. It had been the road, and the road had been what it was. And you couldn't arrive somewhere without traveling the distance. What she felt for that woman, mostly, was recognition, and something close to gratitude. Not for the suffering itself, but for the fact that she'd kept moving through it, which had not always felt possible and sometimes had felt actively impossible. And she'd done it anyway, one day at a time, without knowing where the road went. The road went here. It went to this ranch, and this man, and these children, and this ordinary, imperfect, absolutely specific life. One evening in the fall, Lillian on her hip, Noah at her feet with a wooden horse he'd been given by Pete Dunmore, Ruby somewhere behind her talking to the chicken, who still, after 3 years, had not fully capitulated on the matter of the coop. Clara stood in the doorway of the barn watching Gideon finish up the last of the evening work, and he saw her and said, "You don't have to stand there." "I know," she said. "I want to." He crossed the barn toward her, wiping his hands on a cloth, and when he reached her, he stopped and looked at her face for a moment in the way he'd developed a habit of doing, not searching for anything alarming, but just looking, taking the measure of how she was. "Good day?" he asked. She thought about it. Lillian had been difficult in the morning. Noah had hidden Gideon's best hammer, which had been located eventually in the grain bucket, and the explanation Noah offered for this relocation had been entirely coherent to Noah and incomprehensible to everyone else. Dorothy had gotten a letter from a lawyer about the business with Roy that had needed attention. The chicken had gotten into the kitchen. "Yes," Clara said. "Good day." He nodded. He took Lillian from her hip with one arm, and Lillian grabbed his collar and made a sound of satisfaction, and they walked together back toward the house in the fall evening light. The kind of light that made everything look like it was about to mean something, which was just the light. That was all. It was just the particular quality of fall light on the frontier. But Clara walked through it and let it be what it was, and thought, this is the thing nobody tells you about starting over. They tell you it's brave. They tell you it takes courage to begin again after loss. And that's true. That's real. She would not say it isn't. But what they don't tell you is that the beginning again doesn't feel like courage when you're doing it. It feels like the only available option. It feels like a walk in the dark toward a sound you can't ignore, toward 2 babies crying in a house you've never been in, toward a life you couldn't have planned because you didn't have enough information yet to know it was possible. Courage is just what they call it afterward, when you can see where it went. When you're in it, it just feels like walking. She walked into the house. The door closed behind her. Inside, the lamps were lit against the coming dark, and the sound of children filled the rooms the way it always did. Too loud, too present, completely alive. And outside, the frontier continued in its indifferent way, beautiful and hard, and utterly without opinion about the people who moved across it, making their lives out of what they found and what they lost and what they refused to stop reaching for. That was the frontier. That was the life. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the end, everything.